Welcome to lesson 2. Today what we're going to do is really dig into vulnerability. What is it and what isn't vulnerability? We're going to dispel some of the big myths around vulnerability, and we're going to wrap a definition around it so we can all be clear about what we're talking about. I want to jump right in and start with the myths of vulnerability. If you've seen the TED Talk, you know I'm a 5th generation Texan, very much raised to believe, like many of you, that vulnerability is weakness. Raised in a family where we believed you armor up, you protect yourself, you go out into the world, you get stuff done, and never really let people in to see what you're feeling or thinking, especially if you're hurt. And so I want to start one by one with some of these kind of cultural myths. And let's start with the very top one, that vulnerability is weakness. So here's what we did. We went into the research and we asked thousands of people, what is vulnerability to you? We asked for definitions, we asked for examples and experiences, and here's what we heard. Vulnerability is the first date after my divorce. Vulnerability is trying to get pregnant after my second miscarriage. It's sitting with my wife who has stage 4 breast cancer and trying to make plans for our young children. It's starting my own business. It's having to give someone really difficult feedback. It's receiving difficult feedback. It's getting laid off. It's having to lay off colleagues who I've worked with for 10 years. It's saying, I love you first. One of my favorite kind of shivers down my spine parenting examples. It's sending my son to school knowing how excited he is about making the first chair in orchestra during tryouts, and knowing that there's a possibility that he won't make the orchestra at all. So vulnerability is not weakness. It's the courage to show up and be seen when you have zero control of the outcome. But there are a couple of paradoxes in vulnerability that make it very tricky, and let's take the first. The first paradox of vulnerability is, yes, when I see you do something vulnerable, it looks like courage. But when I do something vulnerable, it feels like weakness. The second paradox is vulnerability is the very first thing I look for when I meet someone. I want to know they're human. I want to know they're imperfect. I want to know they're real, authentic. But the real, imperfect, human, authentic side of me is normally the last thing I want you to see when I meet you. So we have these really complicated paradoxes about vulnerability. I mean, this is just a simple exercise. Close your eyes and think about the last time you saw someone do something really brave, something that was really courageous. And what I would imagine to be true, and what I know to be true as a researcher, is if you think about what you saw, how vulnerable was that person? How vulnerable and open and exposed did they make themselves in that moment? So the very first myth of vulnerability is that it's weakness. In 150,000 pieces of data, I cannot find a single example of courage that was not completely underpinned by vulnerability. You cannot separate the two. And if you do, it's based on mythology, not based on what you live or what you see in your life. The second myth is I can opt out. So one of the things I love is sometimes when I give a talk, I can just look into the audience and tell that 50% of the people are thinking, okay, interesting concept. I don't really do vulnerability, so it doesn't apply to me. Let me give you the definition of vulnerability. It's really straightforward from the data. Vulnerability is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. To be alive is to be vulnerable. You don't get to opt out. Is there anyone watching right now who's never experienced uncertainty, risk, or emotional exposure? No. To be alive is to be vulnerable. To be in relationship is to be vulnerable every day, all day long. To be a leader of people is to be vulnerable every minute of every day. To love someone is to be vulnerable. To care about, to have passion, to care about a project or a process is vulnerable. You can't opt out of vulnerability, but here's what you can do. You can pretend that vulnerability is not happening, and then the consequence of that is you don't do vulnerability, vulnerability does you. In other words, you can either do vulnerability awake and aware of how you're behaving in it, or you can let it just control your life. And if you have any questions about that, gather around some people who you really love and trust and ask them who you are when you're in vulnerability. And I guarantee you, they'll be able to tell you. And if you're not doing it with some level of awareness, you're probably engaged in behaviors that are outside of your values, the ones that we just talked about in lesson 1, and outside of your integrity. So for me, I remember the first time I saw a therapist, she said, I think a lot of this is about your some vulnerability issues. And I'm like, oh, I do have issues, but I don't have vulnerability issues because I don't really do vulnerability. And she said, okay. She said, who would you feel comfortable asking about vulnerability and kind of the behaviors you engage in and who you become when you feel vulnerable? And I said, Steve. So I go home and Steve's, in the kitchen unloading the dishwasher, and I'm like, let me ask you a question. Who do you think I am when I'm in vulnerability? What do I act like? And he gave me this look. He gave me the same look that how do I look in these jeans? He gave me that look. And I'm like, really? Who do you think I am? And he said, do you really want to know? And I said, yeah, I do. And he said, you're dangerous. I said, what do you mean dangerous? And he said, you're dangerous, you make really bad decisions, and you make choices completely outside of your integrity when you're in vulnerability. And I was like, you need to give me an example. So he said, a book contract. And he said, you write a book, and it's an incredibly vulnerable process. Now that I understand what vulnerability is and isn't, I can tell you. Because when you write a book, the only people that really see it are you, a couple of friends, and your agent, and then your agent takes it and shops it out to publishers. And Steve said, when you're shopping a book, you have a list of everything you want in a publishing contract. But the very first publisher that says, we're interested, we'll take it, you're like, sold. And I'll sit down with you and I'll say, but that's not what you want from the contract, and they're not offering you this, and you won't have any control over this. And then this is where your BS mechanism is really good, Renee, because you'll look at me and say, you know what? I don't care about those issues. What I really want is someone who loves my work, and they seem to be the most excited, so I'm going to go with them. And he said, so you make really bad decisions to move very quickly out of uncertainty because you're uncomfortable. So the idea that you can opt out of vulnerability, that somehow in this life, this human life that we're all leading, that we can opt out of ever feeling uncertain, ever feeling like we're in risk, ever feeling like we're emotionally exposed. It doesn't happen. That's a myth. The third myth, vulnerability is letting it all hang out. Let me clarify for everyone in this course. Vulnerability is not live tweeting your bikini wax. It is not sharing the intimate emotional details of your children's reaction to your impending divorce on Facebook. Vulnerability is up close, personal, and it's about trust and intimacy and connection. There's a formula that I want you to write down, memorize, and live by. And it's very simple. Vulnerability minus boundaries is not vulnerability. One of the things I like to tell people is imagine that instead of watching me right now, it's just pitch black in front of you. The room that you're sitting in is pitch black. You cannot see your hand in front of your face. And I reach down here to where my water is and my hand cream, and I pick up an industrial strength floodlight, and I just do this into the camera. And all you see is painful bright light coming at you. What would be your physical reaction to that light? It would be this. You'd squint, you'd do this. That's exactly how we feel when we're on the receiving end of oversharing. What we want to do is this, because we feel, that's why I call it floodlighting. We feel like someone has just pummeled us with information that A, we don't want to know, was not theirs to share, is not comfortable, or we're not in a relationship that can bear the weight of that story. So when you share and when you're vulnerable with someone, the goal of vulnerability is to build trust, to build intimacy, to build connection. But the important lesson here for me around this myth that vulnerability is letting it all hang out is vulnerability is about boundaries. It's about being aware of this. What are you sharing? What is your intention for sharing it? And with whom are you sharing? Those are the big questions. So I have this great story. I was working with a group of CEOs from Silicon Valley, and I was talking about the myths of vulnerability. And we went on a break, and one of the entrepreneurs ran up to me and said, oh my God, vulnerability is the piece of leadership that's missing for me. Here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna be meeting with my VCs, the venture capitalists who fund his company, next week, and I'm just gonna look them in the eye and I'm gonna say, here's the deal. I am broke, we're bleeding money, I'm in over my head, and I don't know what I'm doing. What do you think? And I was like, oh my God. I think it's a really bad idea if you want another series of funding. I think it's not a good idea because what is your intention for sharing that? To say it to the investors or to say it to the team that he's working with is probably not the appropriate person. He probably needs a mentor, a colleague, someone that is the right person. So always check when you're sharing vulnerability. 1, has the person earned the right to hear your story? 2, what is the intention behind the sharing? Why are you sharing it with this person? That's the big question, because vulnerability is not just letting it all hang out. The 4th myth is I can go it alone. So here's the thing. We are neurobiologically hardwired for connection with each other. It's why we're here. We're physically, emotionally, biologically, spiritually wired to be in connection. In the absence of connection, there's always suffering. And vulnerability is the path that connection uses to flow between me and you. There is no connection without vulnerability. And so you can't go it alone. One of the most wonderful experiences I had was giving a talk in Florida, and while I was talking, it was being signed by some American Sign Language translators. And they came up to me before the talk started and they said, are there any words that you're going to be using that we need to know, to make sure we know how to sign? And I said, well, I use the word vulnerability a lot. And they looked at each other and they said, well, the sign for vulnerability is this. And I was like, are you signing weak in the knees? And they said, yeah. And I said, that's not the right sign. And so they kind of huddled and they came back and they said, the only other sign we really know for vulnerability is this. And I said, man, that's the sign. Let me see who you are. Let me see your heart. And for a while, I told that story as an example of vulnerability is not this, it's this. But let me tell you what I believe is the truth about vulnerability is never in my life, as a vulnerability researcher who studied this for 13 years, never once in my life have I ever gone like this without feeling like this. These myths of vulnerability get in our way of who we need to be and how we need to show up. And I can tell you with almost 1,000% certainty that every single one of you in this class with me is up against some of these myths. So before we move into the exercises, it's just so important for us to get clear on these 4 myths. Vulnerability is not weakness. You can't opt out of uncertainty and risk and emotional exposure. It's not letting it all hang out. Vulnerability minus boundaries, not vulnerability. And you can't go it alone because we literally, neurobiologically, we're not made to go it alone.